On a Saturday, in late June, when the roses in St. Mary Mead had decided all at once to be at their pinkest, the village green swelled with bunting and good intentions. Miss Jane Marple, whose roses were always at their pinkest on the Saturday one least expected it, sat beneath the shade of a striped awning where the tea committee dispensed triumphs and catastrophes in equal portions. She had a plate of seed cake before her, a coronation teacup in hand, and her knitting resting in the carpet bag by her feet. Her methodical eyes traveled from one group to another with the affectionate comprehension she afforded all living things, including, and it must be said especially, villagers. A brass band from Much Benham wheezed valiantly through a march. Colonel Hartnell strode as though he had organized the event personally with the Archbishop, and Griselda Clement's laugh rang out near the raffle table, where she had, with perfect fairness, sold more tickets to the Major's enemies than his friends. In the flutter of canvas and skirts and compliments, the everyday tides of St. Mary Mead flowed with familiar rhythm. It was the year, also, of newness. The High Street, glimpsed just beyond the green, had acquired a fresh and impertinent shop front, Winship Photographic, complete with a large plate-glass window that refused the sun as a prudent old maid refuses compliments. The glass was very clear, very modern, and, most oddly, as several ladies had already discovered, quite useless for adjusting one's hat. "It won't do it," declared Mrs. Hartnell, who saw no reason why a window should not behave like a mirror when called upon. She paused with her gloved fingers at her veil and peered at the glass. You might as well be looking at nothing. Perfectly heathenish arrangement. Matthew Winship, the proprietor, thin, pale, and with the uncertain air of one who had not long ago been accustomed to being shouted at by editors rather than colonels' wives, had bowed earlier that morning. "Non-reflective plate, madam," he had replied, stammering slightly. "Museum glass lets you see what is behind, not yourself. No glare for the photographs." "A pity," Miss Marple had murmured then, and now smiled again as Mrs. Hartnell reported the exchange. "I dare say museums think a great many things are improved by not seeing oneself in them. People often prefer a flattering reflection to an honest one." Across from Winship's modern austerity, Lionel Quarles's premises were quite the reverse, a large, comforting confusion of Victorian mahogany, ormolu whatnots, and mirrors that reflected one, if anything, too much. "Quarles and Company, Antiques and Furniture," the gilt lettering announced. Mr. Quarles, a man of sleek charm and hair like polished ebony, had opened his shop only in the spring, and had at once become a person of interest to the village ladies. He was everywhere at once at the fete, producing raffle prizes, praising roses belonging to ladies whom he did not know very well, and offering to value inherited treasures with such tact that one felt grateful whatever the valuation. If his assistant, a pale girl with anxious hands named Tilda Pike, watched him with attention that contradicted his blithe laugh, very few noticed. Mrs. Evangeline Caldecott arrived fashionably late. She had been in St. Mary Mead 3 months, long enough for it to be generally agreed that her fortune was American and her temperament English. She wore a jacket of navy silk and a brooch of sapphires that drew eyes like bees to lavender, and her path across the green left behind small eddies of conjecture. She bought a miniature from Mr. Quarles and then returned it, whispered Doris from the post office to the jam stall. "That kind always takes things back," Mrs. Price Ridley opined with satisfaction. There were, in those 20 minutes before everything altered, small scenes that later would be remembered with needle-sharp clarity. The way Mr. Winship's fingers trembled as he lit a cigarette, and then, apparently remembering his precious non-reflective window, ground it out at once. The glance, careless, perhaps not careless. Mr. Quarles slid towards Mrs. Caldecott as he held aloft a silver vinaigrette, the stiff manner in which Dr. Randall refused refreshments, pleading calls to make. "Mr. Quarles," called Colonel Hartnell at last, "we're ready for you on the platform. Bring your treasure and your patter." "2 minutes, Colonel," Quarles replied cheerfully. I'll fetch something special from the shop, a piece of Georgian silver I'd quite forgotten. A fete deserves its sparkle." He swept a bow and vanished across the road with Tilda in his wake. The sun went behind a cloud and emerged again. The band squared their music, and conversation rose and fell like the tide. 5 minutes passed. 6. Colonel Hartnell's mustache bristled with offended punctuality. "Send the girl," he barked. "We're not merchants of Venice to wait upon a shopman's humour." Tilda was already hurrying back, her face alarmingly white beneath a fringe that would have been tidied without mercy by Mrs. Hartnell in calmer hours. "Colonel, sir, he doesn't answer. Mr. Quarles doesn't answer me. The door's bolted from inside." Bolted from inside. The phrase ran through the crowd and tightened it like a drawn string. People who had come for roses and mild gossip found themselves suddenly in a story they had not ordered. "The bolt sometimes sticks in old shops," said Miss Marple softly, rising and taking up her bag. "Things settle, like ladies after tea." "Come along, Jarvis," the colonel commanded. "Winship, you're thin. Slip round to the back through the lane." They converged upon the antiques shop, drawn as people are when something urgent might need doing. The gilt lettering looked indecently cheerful above the door that would not open. Tilda fumbled at the handle while the little bell above jangled its protest. "Stand aside," said Colonel Hartnell, setting his shoulder with the glee men feel in emergencies. The wood groaned, and with Jarvis's assistance and an old poker from the tea tent, the bolt gave way with a sound like a sigh. It was cool inside, shaded, and it smelt of beeswax, old textiles, a little cigar smoke, and something else that moved through the air on an altogether sharper edge. Mr. Lionel Quarles sat at his small desk behind the counter, one hand lying open upon the blotter, the other fallen into his lap. An overturned teacup spread its brown tide slowly towards a pile of valuation notices. Dr. Randall stepped forward, his face assuming the professional mask that polite society allows doctors to slip on without embarrassment. He bent over the figure, then straightened, his handkerchief pressed to his nose. "Stand back," he said quietly. "We'll need the police." Tilda made a sound that would have been a scream if it had possessed more breath. Miss Marple's hand was already on her arm, guiding her gently toward the door and the bright, innocent sunlight beyond. There, my dear," she whispered. "No good to him and no good to you." As Inspector Lake was summoned from Much Benham and the crowd gathered in hushed clusters on the green, Miss Marple noticed several small things that others overlooked. The way the dust lay undisturbed on the skirting behind the counter, the tiny scuff mark on the polished wood as though a small bottle had been set down hastily, and most particularly the fact that Mrs. Evangeline Caldecott had turned away from the shop and was walking back toward the tea tent with a deliberation that suggested a promise made to herself in a voice no one else had heard. Between Winship's window that would not reflect and Quarles's mirrors that reflected everything, the village of St. Mary Mead stood with its face suddenly bared to the sun, while the quiet mechanism of consequence began to tick with deadly precision. The Rose fete would be remembered not for its prizes or its pleasant afternoon, but as the day when murder came to call in the most impossible of circumstances. A locked room, a bolted door, and a window that refused to show the truth of what it had witnessed. Inspector Lake arrived from Much Benham within the hour, bringing with him the calm authority of a man who had seen enough sudden deaths to know that haste helped no one and harmed the evidence. He was tall, methodical, and possessed of the particular patience that comes from understanding that murders, like knots, yielded only to steady pressure applied in the right direction. His sergeant, Miller, began stringing rope across the shop entrance while the inspector surveyed the scene with the detached interest of a scholar examining a particularly complex theorem. The locked room presented itself with all the stubborn impossibility that such puzzles demanded. The bolt on the door had indeed been shot from within, its brass surface unmarked by tampering. The Windows remained latched, their catches undisturbed by so much as a fingerprint in the accumulated dust of summer. Dr. Randall, summoned to make his preliminary examination. Official, emerged from behind the counter with the grave expression that medical men adopt when death has been neither peaceful nor natural. "Poison, I should say," he murmured to Inspector Lake, gesturing toward the overturned teacup. "Something alkaloid in nature. Swift acting. The pupils and that particular sweet, acrid odor suggest as much. We'll know more after the post-mortem, naturally." The word poison rippled through the assembled villagers with the peculiar satisfaction that accompanies the confirmation of one's darkest suspicions. Murder was shocking, but poison was interesting. It suggested premeditation, cunning, and the sort of domestic treachery that made excellent conversation over dinner tables for months to come. Inspector Lake moved about the shop with careful deliberation, his notebook appearing and disappearing like a conjuring trick. The dust lay even as a cloth behind the counter, disturbed only by a small crescent near the blotter, as though a tiny bottle had been set down and snatched away. Mr. Quarles's right thumb bore a delicate smear of soot, curious in a shop that boasted no lamps or fires. The teapot on the spirit stove behind the counter still held warmth, and the brown tide from the overturned cup had reached the edge of a neat pile of valuation notices. Tilda Pike, when questioned, proved to be a fountain of grief-stricken but unhelpful information. She'd worked for Mr. Quarles since Easter and found him the kindest of employers. He drank tea constantly throughout the day, preparing it himself on the small spirit stove. No, she had not seen anyone enter the shop that afternoon. Though, she added with the sudden precision that shock sometimes lends to memory, he had seemed rather excited that morning, humming under his breath and polishing things that were already quite clean enough. Mrs. Caldecott, when her turn came, proved to be a study in controlled composure. She had known Mr. Quarles only slightly, she explained in her careful voice that carried just the faintest trace of American inflection. She had purchased a miniature from him in May and returned it when she discovered it was not, as represented, a genuine causeway. Mr. Quarles had been most apologetic and refunded her money without question. Miss Marple, listening from her strategic position near poor Tilda, noticed that Mrs. Caldecott's account was delivered with the sort of careful accuracy that suggested rehearsal. Not dishonesty, necessarily, but certainly preparation. She observed, too, the way Matthew Winship's pale hands fidgeted with his camera strap as he explained that he had been in his darkroom during the crucial period, developing wedding photographs in absolute darkness. "Though I did hear voices," Winship added, his voice barely above a whisper. "From Mr. Quarles's shop, I mean. Just before you called me to help with the door, a conversation of some sort, though I couldn't make out the words." Inspector Lake's pen paused above his notebook. If Quarles had been speaking to someone, where had that someone gone? The shop yielded no secrets to further examination, no hidden passages, no convenient chimneys, no accommodating wardrobes. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple found herself studying the arrangement of objects on the desk where Lionel Quarles had met his end. Tucked beneath the blotter's corner, almost invisible, was the edge of what appeared to be a photograph. She mentioned this discovery to Inspector Lake with the diffident air of one who hoped not to be thought presumptuous. The photograph, when carefully extracted, proved to be a studio portrait of a young woman with anxious eyes and pale hands. Remarkably similar, Miss Marple thought, to someone she had seen quite recently, though in rather different circumstances. Inspector Lake held the photograph between careful fingers, studying the young woman's face in the afternoon light that streamed through Winship's peculiar window. The subject possessed delicate features and wore her dark hair in the fashionable waves of the previous year, but it was the confident tilt of her chin and the way her hands were positioned that caught his professional attention. This was someone accustomed to being photographed, someone who understood her own beauty. Matthew Winship, summoned from his nervous hovering near the doorway, confirmed what the studio mounting suggested. "Yes, that's my work," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The lighting, the background screen. I remember the sitting. It was commissioned through Mr. Quarles about 6 weeks ago. He was very particular about the finish. Insisted on the finest paper stock." Winship's pale hands fidgeted with his camera strap as he spoke. The subject came with him naturally. He waited during the entire session, which was unusual. Most gentlemen prefer to return later for collection. Inspector Lake turned to Tilda Pike, who had been watching this exchange with the frozen attention of a rabbit that has spotted the hawk's shadow. "Do you recognize this young woman, Miss Pike?" The question seemed to strike Tilda like a physical blow. Her face, already pale from the afternoon's shocks, became positively ashen. She reached for the counter's edge to steady herself, and Miss Marple, with the swift kindness that had guided her through decades of village crises, was immediately at her side. "Take your time, dear," Miss Marple murmured. "These things are never as dreadful as they seem at first glance." Tilda drew a shaking breath and looked directly at the photograph. "It's Vera," she whispered. "Mrs. Vera Quarles. She was my sister, and she was Lionel's wife." The revelation settled over the assembled group like the hush that follows thunder. Inspector Lake's pen moved steadily across his notebook while Dr. Randall cleared his throat with the particular sound medical men make when they suddenly find themselves in possession of information that casts previous assumptions in an entirely new light. "Mrs. Quarles died 18 months ago," Tilda continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, as though the truth itself provided some measure of relief. "A motor accident on the coast road near Brighton. Lionel was driving, but he wasn't hurt. Vera was thrown from the car when they struck a tree in the fog. The inquest ruled it accidental, but Lionel blamed himself terribly. That's why he came to St. Mary Mead. To escape the memories, he said. London held too much of her." Miss Marple studied the photograph with renewed interest, noting the wedding ring that caught the studio lighting with deliberate prominence. "A lovely girl," she observed gently, "though she seems quite young to have been married long." 6 months, Tilda replied, her voice catching slightly. "They were only married 6 months when she died. Vera was 23, 2 years younger than me. She'd been working as a shop assistant in Brighton when Lionel met her. He quite swept her off her feet with his charm and his talk of beautiful things and the elegant life they would share. She wrote to me that she felt like Cinderella, marrying into such refinement." Inspector Lake made several careful notes before continuing his examination of the shop's contents. The locked room presented its challenges with stubborn consistency. The back door remained barred from within by a stout wooden beam that showed no signs of recent disturbance. The windows were latched tight, and the dust on the sills lay undisturbed by so much as a fingerprint. Dr. Randall, completing his preliminary examination, confirmed his earlier suspicions about the cause of death. A cyanide compound would account for the particular odor and the rapidity of the symptoms, he explained to Inspector Lake. Silver cleaners often contain such substances. They're quite effective against tarnish. Mr. Quarles, dealing as he did in antique jewelry and silverware, would have had legitimate access to such materials. The doctor paused, then added with careful precision, "I should mention that I left my surgery at precisely 2:45 this afternoon to visit Mrs. Pierce in Abbey Lane. She's bedridden and enjoys company. I remained with her until we heard the commotion from the green." The afternoon sun, slanting now at a sharper angle through the shop window, illuminated details that had been obscured earlier. Miss Marple found herself particularly drawn to a display case near the counter, where an array of antique jewelry caught the light with calculated brilliance. Among the pieces, a sapphire brooch drew her attention, not merely for its beauty, which was considerable, but for its striking resemblance to the ornament Mrs. Caldecott had worn to the fete. "Mr. Quarles specialized in jewelry, then?" Inspector Lake inquired. "Oh yes, that was his particular expertise," Tilda replied, warming slightly to a subject that clearly held pleasant memories. He had the most wonderful eye for precious stones, could spot a reproduction from across a room. He often said that people revealed their true character through their choice of jewelry, especially the ladies. He could tell the most extraordinary stories about his customers based simply on what they chose to wear and how they wore it. Matthew Winship, who had been listening with the careful attention of one uncertain whether to remain or flee, suddenly spoke up. He mentioned something similar to me once, said he'd learned to read people like books through their jewelry preferences, claimed he could identify a confidence trickster by the way they handled precious stones, something about the difference between genuine appreciation and calculated assessment. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with quiet purpose as she processed this information. The photograph of Vera Quarles remained propped against the counter, the young woman's confident smile seeming oddly at variance with the tragedy that had befallen her. Something about the timing troubled Miss Marple's methodical mind, though she could not yet articulate precisely what it was. As Inspector Lake concluded his preliminary examination and began making arrangements for the shop to be sealed pending further investigation, Miss Marple found herself studying the curious properties of Winship's non-reflective window. Standing outside, one could see clearly into both shops, but those inside looking out would see only the world beyond, never their own reflection. It struck her as a rather apt metaphor for the human condition. People so often saw everything except themselves. Near the shop's entrance, she noticed a small mark on the doorframe at roughly shoulder height, a smudge of what appeared to be the same soot that had marked the dead man's thumb. How it had come to be there remained yet another puzzle in an afternoon that had already provided quite enough mysteries for any reasonable person's comfort. The photograph of Vera Quarles continued to smile from the counter as the investigation proceeded, her wedding ring catching the fading light like a small, bright promise that had somehow gone terribly and irrevocably wrong. The evening brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a village when ordinary routine has been shattered by extraordinary events. Inspector Lake had established his temporary headquarters in the vicarage parlor, where the photograph of Vera Quarles lay propped against his evidence folder like an accusation waiting to be answered. The contradiction between Tilda's certainty and Winship's equally firm recollection of a recent sitting hung in the air with the persistence of incense. Mrs. Evangeline Caldecott appeared at the vicarage door as the church clock struck 6, requesting a private word with an urgency that contradicted her usual composed demeanor. She entered with the careful precision of someone who had made a difficult decision and intended to see it through regardless of consequences. "Inspector," she began, settling herself with deliberate grace, "I believe I should clarify certain aspects of my relationship with Mr. Quarles that may prove relevant to your investigation." Her hands, Miss Marple noted, no longer bore the sapphire brooch that had caught so many eyes at the fete. Inspector Lake's pen materialized as though summoned. Mrs. Caldecott drew a measured breath and continued, "When I mentioned returning a miniature to Mr. Quarles, I was truthful, but perhaps incomplete. The piece was represented as a causeway and bore what appeared to be the appropriate signature. However, my late husband taught me to recognize certain characteristics that distinguish genuine works from clever reproductions." She paused, accepting tea from Griselda with grateful composure. "The miniature was beautiful, Inspector, and the workmanship exceptional, but it was not a causeway, and Mr. Quarles knew it when he sold it to me. When confronted, he became genuinely frightened. Not embarrassed, but frightened. He asked repeatedly whether I intended to mention the matter to anyone else, and seemed enormously relieved when I assured him I had no such intention." The implications settled over the room like evening shadows. Inspector Lake made careful notes before responding. "Did you form any opinion about whether this might have been an isolated incident?" "I made discreet inquiries through London contacts," Mrs. Caldecott replied, her voice tightening slightly. Mr. Quarles had developed something of a reputation for pieces that proved, upon expert examination, to be rather less than they initially appeared. Nothing definitively fraudulent, but a concerning pattern among certain dealers. Inspector Lake had been preparing to explore this revelation further when Sergeant Miller returned from his examination of the antique shop, bearing a small evidence bag and an expression of professional satisfaction. "The cupboard beneath the counter, sir," Miller reported. "Mr. Quarles kept his cleaning supplies in a wooden tray, bottles and brushes, all very orderly. But there's a clear space where something's missing, and the dust pattern suggests a small bottle, recently removed." Inspector Lake examined the tray Miller produced, noting the clean crescent in the dust that echoed the faint mark on Quarles's counter. The ghost of bitter almonds lingered about the wood like an accusation. Matthew Winship chose this moment to appear, his camera bag clutched defensively and his pale face bearing the expression of one wrestling with conscience. "Inspector, I've been reconsidering what I observed this afternoon. When I mentioned hearing voices from Mr. Quarles's shop, I should have been more precise about the timing. It was just after 3:30, and the conversation seemed quite heated." He paused, gathering courage. "There's something else. About a week ago, I noticed Mr. Quarles examining one of my wedding photographs rather intently, a local couple from Much Benham. When he saw me watching, he moved away quickly, as though embarrassed to have been caught staring. Dr. Randall arrived as these testimonies accumulated, bearing preliminary results that only deepened the mystery. The cyanide concentration was quite high, Inspector, suggesting death within minutes of ingestion, yet the body's position indicates Mr. Quarles had time to set down his cup and attempt to rise before collapsing. The timeline doesn't align with what I'd expect from such rapid-acting poison." Mrs. Price Ridley, who had waited with the patience of a cat at a mouse hole, finally delivered her contribution. "I saw her by that dreadful window at 2:30, she declared, indicating Mrs. Caldecott with righteous certainty. "Standing bold as brass, looking into the shop." Mrs. Caldecott regarded her with polite mildness. "At 2:30, I was with Mrs. Hartnell at the cake stall, admiring the angel cake." "She can confirm it." Mrs. Hartnell, appealed to, corroborated with military precision. Miss Marple, however, noticed the infinitesimal tightening at the corner of Mrs. Caldecott's mouth when the window was mentioned, and the way her hands had unconsciously sought the absent brooch. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself returning to the puzzle of the soot marks, one on the dead man's thumb, another on the shop's doorframe. In the establishment that boasted no lamps, no fires, and no obvious source of such contamination, their presence suggested a story yet untold. The locked room held its secrets with stubborn persistence, but human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely so successfully secured. The photograph of Vera Quarles continued to smile from Inspector Lake's folder, her confident expression a reminder that Saturday's tragedy had roots reaching far deeper than a village fete could ever reveal. Night gathered gently over St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the peculiar hush that follows extraordinary events. Inspector Lake had established himself in the vicarage parlor, where the photograph of Vera Quarles lay propped against his evidence folder like a question waiting to be answered. The contradiction between Tilda's tearful certainty and Winship's equally firm recollection of a recent sitting hung in the air with uncomfortable persistence. Miss Marple, appearing at his elbow with the faintly apologetic air of one about to suggest something inconveniently practical, cleared her throat delicately. "If it would not be too much trouble, Inspector, might we examine Mr. Quarles' door once more? I have sometimes found that doors tell the truth more readily than people do, particularly when they've been asked to perform impossible tasks." Inspector Lake, who had learned to respect the observations of elderly ladies with knitting bags, nodded at once. "Miller, sir, fetch the torch." They crossed to the darkened High Street, where Winship's non-reflective window rendered the night into perfect transparency. Inside the sealed antique shop, the air held its mingled aromas of beeswax, old textiles, and something sharper that lingered like an accusation. Miss Marple went directly to the inner face of the door, studying the brass bolt and the wood around it with methodical attention. "Hold the light just there, Sergeant," she murmured, her gloved finger hovering over a faint smudge along the wood grain. The torch beam caught a thin line of black and tucked into the crevice where the bolt slid home, the ghost of something that had once been substantial but was now mere ash. Miller produced his tweezers with practiced efficiency, teasing out the fragment with exaggerated care. It crumbled at his touch, leaving behind the acrid scent of burnt cord and the unmistakable residue of a slow-burning fuse. "A timing device," Inspector Lake observed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had found the missing piece of a particularly vexing puzzle. "Someone rigged the bolt to slide home after they'd left the premises. Quite ingenious, really." Miss Marple nodded with gentle approval. "A clever boy in our village once contrived to lock his sister in the coal shed using much the same principle. A candle, a length of string, and a great deal of mischief. The string burns through and releases whatever was holding the bolt back. His mother was not amused, though she admitted it showed considerable ingenuity." Inspector Lake examined the positioning carefully, measuring angles with his pen. This would allow someone to leave the shop, appear publicly elsewhere, and have the door lock itself automatically. But they'd still need to introduce the poison, and the timing suggests they knew exactly when Quarles would drink his tea. Miss Marple's attention had wandered to the brass letter slot, positioned at precisely the right height to align with the counter where the fatal teacup had sat. A great many crimes are accomplished with nothing more elaborate than the ordinary conveniences of life, she observed mildly. A paper funnel, perhaps, and steady nerves. It was quite fortunate for the murderer, though decidedly unfortunate for Mr. Quarles, that his counter sat so conveniently near the door. The following morning brought crystalline clarity that made secrets seem particularly burdensome. Miss Marple, armed with her customary knitting and an uncommonly early constitutional, found herself once again drawn to the High Street, where Matthew Winship emerged from his shop with the hesitant manner of one who had spent the night examining his conscience. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice barely carrying across the morning stillness, "I've been reconsidering what I observed yesterday when I mentioned hearing voices from Mr. Quarles's shop. I should have been more precise about the timing and sequence of events." He drew nervously on his cigarette, then remembered his precious window and moved several steps away. "The thing is, I've been developing photographs for 15 years, and one develops certain habits about time and sequence. I heard the shop bell ring twice during the crucial period, once at 3:15, and again perhaps 10 minutes later. Yet when we forced the door, Mr. Quarles was alone." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their steady rhythm. Memory can be such a helpful thing when it's given proper encouragement. The bell rings both when someone enters and when they leave. "Always," Winship confirmed eagerly. Mr. Quarles was quite proud of it, had it tuned to a particular pitch, said it announced customers with proper dignity. When Inspector Lake was presented with this information over breakfast, he received it with the careful attention it deserved. The timeline was becoming increasingly complex, but the burnt cord discovery provided the mechanism that made it all possible. Someone had entered Quarles's shop, set up the timing device, introduced poison into his tea routine, and departed well before the bolt slid home automatically. The morning also brought Tilda Pike and Matthew Winship to the vicarage, summoned to resolve the troubling discrepancy about the photograph. Inspector Lake placed the studio portrait on the table between them, the young woman's confident smile seeming oddly at variance with the tension in the room. "Miss Pike, you identified this as your deceased sister Vera. Mr. Winship, you state you took this photograph 6 weeks ago. Both cannot be true." Tilda studied the image with growing confusion. "But it is Vera," she insisted, her voice trembling. "The way she holds her head, that little curl by her ear, it's exactly like her." Winship wrung his hands. "Inspector, I assure you I took this photograph myself, not 2 months past." Mr. Quarles brought the lady in, was very particular about the results. She was heavily veiled when she entered and left, kept her back to the window. I thought it rather odd, but clients have their eccentricities. Miss Marple, who had been listening with the careful attention she afforded all revelations of human complexity, asked gently, "Was the lady silent during the sitting, Mr. Winship?" "Mostly, yes. Mr. Quarles did most of the talking, giving instructions. She nodded or gave brief replies. Her voice was rather soft, almost breathy. Some people are camera shy." A cold certainty began to form in Miss Marple's mind. The previous evening, when she had served Tilda cocoa by her own fireside, she had noticed something that contradicted the girl's earlier account of her sister's distinguishing mark. Tilda had mentioned a crescent scar on Vera's left wrist from a childhood accident, yet when Miss Marple had observed Tilda's own wrists in the lamplight, she had seen only the pale, unmarked skin of youth. "Mr. Winship," she said thoughtfully, "did the lady wear gloves during the sitting?" "Yes, short kid gloves." Mr. Quarles preferred that for the composition. Said bare hands were vulgar in daylight portraits. The implications settled over the room like morning mist. If someone had been impersonating the dead Vera Quarles, the gloves would conveniently conceal any telltale absence of identifying marks. But why would Lionel Quarles commission such a deception? And who was the woman who had posed for what was clearly intended to be a posthumous portrait of his deceased wife? Dr. Randall's arrival with additional forensic findings added another layer to the puzzle. "I've examined the teacup more thoroughly, Inspector. The cyanide was introduced through silver polish, the type used for cleaning valuable pieces. It appears the poison was mixed with the cleaning compound rather than added directly to the tea." Tilda, when questioned about her employer's cleaning habits, provided information that cast this discovery in curious light. Mr. Quarles was most particular about his silver. He cleaned the Georgian tea service personally every morning, but yesterday he cleaned it twice. Once when I arrived at 9 and again when I returned from the post office at 2:30. He seemed quite agitated, muttering about fingerprints and unauthorized handling. As the morning progressed, the pieces of the puzzle began to assume a more definite shape. Someone had commissioned a photograph of a woman resembling the dead Vera Quarles. Someone had tampered with the silver cleaning supplies, and someone had used an ingenious timing device to create the illusion of an impossible crime. The question was no longer simply who had killed Lionel Quarles, but why someone had found it necessary to resurrect his dead wife in a photographer's studio, and what role that resurrection had played in his ultimate destruction. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay somewhere in the complex intersection of grief, deception, and the peculiar human tendency to see only what one expected to see, rather than what was actually there. The mystery of the locked room had been solved, but the mystery of human motivation remained as opaque as Winship's non-reflective window, which revealed everything except the truth about those who stood before it. The morning brought with it the peculiar clarity that often follows revelation, and Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the question of human nature under pressure. She had observed over many years of village life that people under strain often revealed their truest selves in the smallest gestures, and Tilda Pike's trembling hands as she poured tea suggested a burden that extended far beyond grief for her employer. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling beside the young woman in the vicarage garden, "I find that secrets have a way of growing heavier with time, rather like wet wool. Perhaps it would be a kindness to yourself to share what troubles you." Tilda's composure crumbled with the suddenness of a dam giving way. Through tears and stammered words, the truth emerged in painful fragments. She had indeed posed for the photograph that bore such uncanny resemblance to her deceased sister. Mr. Quarles had approached her 6 weeks ago with what he described as a sentimental request. He wished to have a proper portrait of his beloved Vera, something finer than the amateur snapshots from their brief courtship. "He gave me her wedding ring to wear," Tilda whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze. said it would make the portrait more authentic. He was so gentle about it, so grief-stricken, that I couldn't refuse. And there was money. Not much, but enough to help with Mother's medicine. She paused, gathering courage for the more damaging admission. Only later I learned it wasn't sentiment at all. He told Mrs. Caldecott the portrait proved the sapphires he was selling had belonged to his wife, part of a family set with documented provenance. Inspector Lake, summoned by Miss Marple's carefully worded message, listened to this confession with the grim satisfaction of a man watching puzzle pieces fall into their proper places. The fraud was clear enough. Quarles had been using the fabricated portrait to authenticate valuable jewelry that had never belonged to his deceased wife. But fraud alone did not explain the elaborate murder that had followed. The answer came when Miller, searching Quarles' desk more thoroughly, discovered what the dead man had hidden beneath his blotter. The letter was gone, but its impression remained in the leather surface, and a soft pencil rubbed gently across the indentations revealed the ghost of threatening words. "Bring the sapphire brooch to the fete at 3:30, or be exposed as the fraud you are." Blackmail, Inspector Lake observed grimly. Someone discovered his deception and was demanding payment for their silence. Mrs. Caldecott, when confronted with this evidence, maintained her composed demeanor, but her answers carried a new precision. "Inspector, I'm not in the habit of making threats, written or otherwise. However, I will admit that when I discovered the fraudulent nature of both the miniature and the sapphires, I made certain inquiries through my late husband's connections in the art world. Mr. Quarles had developed quite a reputation for pieces that proved less authentic upon expert examination." Miss Marple studied the American widow with renewed interest, noting the way her hands unconsciously sought the absent sapphire brooch. "You mentioned yesterday that your brooch was genuine and had been yours for years. Might one ask where you acquired such a beautiful piece?" Mrs. Caldecott's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. "From my late husband's collection. He purchased it in London before the war, from a dealer in Bond Street who specialized in Georgian jewelry." Dr. Randall's arrival interrupted this delicate exchange, bringing with him medical findings that cast the murder in an entirely new light. "Inspector, I've completed a more thorough analysis of the poison concentration. The cyanide was indeed delivered through silver polish, but in a most ingenious manner. The compound was mixed with the cleaning solution in such a way that it would only become lethal when combined with the particular acids used in treating Georgian silver. The implications were staggering. Someone with intimate knowledge of Quarles' cleaning habits had prepared a poison that would only activate when he performed his daily ritual of polishing the antique tea service. The murderer had turned the victim's own meticulous nature against him. Tilda, when questioned about her employer's cleaning routine, provided the final piece of this deadly puzzle. Mr. Quarles cleaned the Georgian set every morning without fail. He said proper maintenance was the difference between a valuable antique and expensive rubbish. But yesterday he cleaned it twice. The second time he seemed quite agitated, muttering about fingerprints and unauthorized handling. Someone had touched the silver after his morning cleaning, Miss Marple observed quietly. Someone whose fingerprints he felt compelled to remove, even at the cost of his own life. Inspector Lake was preparing to explore this revelation further when Griselda burst into the parlor with barely contained alarm. "Inspector, I'm terribly sorry, but the photograph, the one of that poor girl, it's disappeared from your folder. I saw it there not 10 minutes ago when I brought the tea, and now it's simply gone." The theft sent a chill through the assembled group that had nothing to do with the morning air. Someone within reach of the vicarage parlor had just demonstrated that the photograph represented a threat worth considerable risk to eliminate. Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully toward Winship's non-reflective window across the street, where the morning scene composed itself with deceptive tranquility. "How curious," she murmured, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for observations that were anything but casual. One might almost think the photograph had served its purpose and was no longer needed. Or perhaps someone feared it might serve a purpose they had not intended. As the investigation entered this new phase, it became clear that the murder of Lionel Quarles was merely the final act in a drama that had been building for months. Someone had discovered his fraudulent activities, had used that knowledge to extract payment, and had ultimately decided that permanent silence was preferable to continued blackmail. The locked room had been designed not merely to kill, but to ensure that all evidence of the blackmailer's identity died with their victim. The question that remained was which of the seemingly respectable inhabitants of St. Mary Mead possessed both the knowledge to devise such an elaborate murder and the cold calculation to carry it through to its deadly conclusion. Miss Marple suspected that the answer, like the truth that Winship's window refused to reflect, was closer at hand than anyone had yet dared to imagine. The theft of the photograph sent Inspector Lake into immediate action, his professional instincts sharpened by the brazen nature of the crime. Someone had taken considerable risk to eliminate evidence from under their very noses, which suggested the portrait represented a threat far more serious than mere embarrassment. His first thought was characteristically methodical. If the photograph mattered enough to steal, its negative would matter even more. Matthew Winship's shop, with its deceptive window that revealed everything while reflecting nothing, became the next focus of their attention. The photographer's hands trembled as he unlocked his filing cabinet, producing an envelope marked in his careful script, QV Portrait, June. The envelope gaped empty, its flap showing the telltale tear of hasty fingers. Winship stared at the void with the expression of a man watching his world collapse in careful increments. "I locked this cabinet myself yesterday evening," he whispered, his voice barely carrying across the morning stillness. "No one else has the key." The negative should have been there with the spare prints. His pale features had taken on the waxy quality of old candles, and his usual nervous fidgeting had intensified to barely controlled tremors. Inspector Lake examined the cabinet with professional thoroughness, noting the scratches around the lock that suggested recent tampering. "When did you last see the negative, Mr. Winship?" "Friday afternoon, when Mr. Quarles collected his prints. He was very particular about having all copies accounted for. Said it was a private commission, and he didn't want any unauthorized reproductions floating about." Winship's voice caught slightly on the words, as though he were beginning to understand their sinister implications. Dr. Randall's arrival with additional forensic findings cast this discovery in an even more troubling light. "Inspector, I've completed my analysis of the poison compound. The silver polish that killed Mr. Quarles contained acids specifically used in photographic developing processes, compounds that wouldn't be available to the general public but would be standard supplies in any professional darkroom." The implications struck the assembled group like a physical blow. Inspector Lake's attention focused on Winship with renewed intensity, noting how the photographer's already pale complexion had turned positively ashen. "Mr. Winship, you would have access to such chemicals in your professional capacity?" "Yes," Winship admitted reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Silver-treating compounds are essential for certain specialized processes, but I keep all dangerous chemicals locked in my darkroom safe. No one else knows the combination." Miss Marple, who had been listening with the careful attention she afforded all human revelations, suggested gently that they examine the darkroom immediately. "Chemical accidents can be so dangerous," she observed mildly, though her eyes held a sharpness that contradicted her innocent tone. The darkroom revealed a space that was both meticulously organized and recently disturbed. Bottles of developing chemicals stood in neat rows, but several gaps suggested recent removal of materials. Most significantly, the safe that Winship claimed secured his most dangerous compounds stood open, its contents scattered as though someone had searched through them with desperate haste. "This is impossible," Winship stammered, staring at the chaos. "I locked this myself yesterday morning before the fete. The combination is known only to me." Inspector Lake examined the safe's mechanism with professional interest. noting the faint traces of graphite powder on the combination dial, a technique used to reveal fingerprint residue and deduce the proper sequence of numbers. Near the developing trays, Miss Marple discovered a small wastebasket containing what appeared to be photographic scraps. Beneath crumpled sheets of paper, she found a fragment no larger than a postage stamp, but clearly showing a portion of a woman's hand wearing what appeared to be a wedding ring. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we may have found a piece of our missing photograph." While this discovery raised as many questions as it answered, it was overshadowed by Inspector Lake's determination to locate the sapphire brooch that had figured so prominently in the blackmail note. Miss Marple's suggestion that they search Quarles's shop more thoroughly proved prescient. In a faded Georgian tea caddy near the spirit stove, wrapped in protective chamois, lay a brooch whose sapphires caught the morning light like fragments of captured sky. Mrs. Caldecott's reaction when confronted with the jewelry was immediate and unmistakable. Her composed facade cracked just enough to reveal genuine recognition, and when she reached to examine the piece, the pin pricked her finger, drawing a small drop of blood that she quickly pressed away with her handkerchief. "It is mine," she admitted simply, her voice carrying the weight of inevitable truth. "There's a tiny nick on the second claw setting that you'd never notice unless you'd examined it closely for years. My late husband had it repaired in London before the war, but the jeweler's work left that small imperfection." Inspector Lake leaned forward with careful attention. "Then perhaps you can explain why you were wearing what appears to be an imitation yesterday, and why this genuine piece was hidden in Mr. Quarles's tea caddy." Mrs. Caldecott's composure steadied as though she had finally found firm ground beneath her feet. "Because Mr. Quarles had substituted a paste copy for my genuine brooch. I discovered the deception on Friday evening when the stones showed that telltale dullness under gaslight that genuine sapphires never possess. Yesterday morning, I confronted him directly. He claimed he needed to remove incriminating traces before returning my property and asked me to wear the imitation at the fete for appearance's sake. He promised to bring the real brooch by 3:30. "And did you see him at that appointed time?" Miss Marple inquired with deceptive casualness. Mrs. Caldecott hesitated before answering. "I did visit his shop at 25 minutes past 3. We had words about his delays and excuses. He was cleaning the brooch obsessively, muttering about fingerprints and unauthorized handling. When I demanded immediate return of my property, he asked me to return at precisely 3:30. I left in considerable irritation." Miss Marple noted with interest that Mrs. Caldecott's hands showed no trace of the silver polish that had killed Quarles, despite her admitted presence in his shop during the crucial period. "How very careful you were not to touch anything during your visit," she observed mildly. The conversation was interrupted by Tilda Pike, who had been listening with growing agitation before finally summoning the courage to speak. "Inspector, I've remembered something important about yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Price Ridley had Mr. Quarles's spare key for several days in May. She borrowed it when her brooch caught on the wire mesh of our letter slot, and I had to fetch pliers to free it. She promised to return the key later, but I never saw it again. Mr. Quarles was quite upset when he discovered it missing and had the locks changed the very next day." Inspector Lake looked up sharply from his notes. This revelation cast the locked room mystery in an entirely new light. If Mrs. Price Ridley had retained a key, even an old one, it might have provided access for reconnaissance or preparation that made the elaborate timing device possible. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the high street, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the various threads that were slowly weaving together into a pattern of calculated deception. The murdered man had been engaged in systematic fraud, using fabricated documentation and substituted jewelry to deceive his customers. Someone had discovered this deception and had progressed from blackmail to murder when simple extortion proved insufficient. The locked room had been achieved through ingenious mechanical means, but the poison had been delivered through an even more cunning exploitation of human nature. The victim's own compulsive habits had been turned against him with deadly precision. The theft of both the photograph and its negative suggested that the murderer was still actively protecting their secret, still calculating their next moves with the same cold intelligence that had planned Quarles's death. Standing before Winship's non-reflective window, Miss Marple reflected on how aptly it symbolized their investigation. Everyone could see clearly into the mystery from the outside, but those within remained blind to their own roles in the deadly drama that had unfolded in their seemingly peaceful village. The truth, like a proper reflection, remained stubbornly elusive, requiring just the right angle of light and observation to reveal itself completely. The window that wouldn't reflect had become more than mere glass. It was a metaphor for the human tendency to see everything except one's own guilt, to observe every detail of others' behavior while remaining blind to the consequences of one's own actions. Soon, Miss Marple suspected, that metaphorical reflection would become startlingly, devastatingly clear. The revelation about Mrs. Price Ridley's retained key demanded immediate investigation, and Inspector Lake found the formidable lady in her garden, deadheading roses with the methodical precision she applied to all village affairs. Her initial protestations about police interference dissolved rapidly when confronted with Tilda's testimony, though her explanations carried the careful rehearsal of one who had anticipated such questions. The truth is, she admitted with considerable reluctance, "I quite forgot I had the wretched thing until I discovered it in my sewing basket last week. By then it seemed too trivial to mention, particularly as Mr. Quarles had already changed his locks. I tested it Thursday evening, merely to satisfy myself that he had been truthful about the alterations." She lifted her chin with defensive dignity. One likes to know if one is being deceived by tradespeople. Inspector Lake examined the key with professional interest, noting the fresh scratches that suggested recent use against resistant metal. Mrs. Price Ridley's admission that she had gained access to examine the lock mechanism opened disturbing possibilities about advanced preparation for Saturday's murder. Miss Marple, who had accompanied the inspector with a tactful observation that elderly ladies often found other elderly ladies less threatening than policemen, studied Mrs. Price Ridley's hands with gentle attention. "How carefully you tend your roses, dear, though I notice you've been handling something that leaves rather distinctive marks. Soot, perhaps, or charcoal from garden work." Mrs. Price Ridley's glance at her fingertips was involuntary, quickly suppressed. "I was cleaning the lamp chimneys yesterday evening. One cannot allow such things to accumulate, particularly with important events approaching." The explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple noticed the way Mrs. Price Ridley's right thumb bore the same dark smudging they had observed on the dead man's hand. Lamp cleaning was indeed a reasonable source of such marks, but the pattern suggested contact with something more concentrated than ordinary soot. Their investigation was interrupted by Matthew Winship, who appeared at Mrs. Price Ridley's gate with barely controlled agitation. "Inspector, someone has been in my shop again, this morning while I was at the post office. Nothing dramatic this time, but my files have been searched, and I'm certain my spare key is missing." Inspector Lake's attention sharpened immediately. "The same person who took the photograph and negative?" "I believe so, but this time they left something behind." Winship produced a small object wrapped in his handkerchief. A woman's glove, caught on the filing cabinet lock. Kid leather, quite good quality, but stained with what appears to be photographic fixer. The glove proved to be right-handed, size small, with a distinctive tear along the index finger that suggested hasty movement in confined spaces. More significantly, it bore traces of the same dark residue that had marked both Quarles's thumb and Mrs. Price Ridley's fingers. Mrs. Caldecott's arrival at this moment seemed providential, though her pale composure suggested she had not come merely for social purposes. "Inspector, I've received some rather disturbing information through my London contacts that may bear on Mr. Quarles's death." She paused, gathering her thoughts with visible effort. It appears his fraudulent activities extended far beyond our village. There have been similar cases reported in Bath, Cheltenham, and Brighton over the past 18 months. She produced a telegram from her reticule, its brief message confirming what her careful inquiries had revealed. Lionel Quarles had been operating under several names, establishing himself in prosperous communities long enough to build trust before systematically defrauding customers through substituted jewelry and fabricated provenance. The pattern was always the same, Mrs. Caldecott explained. He would arrive as a widower, use his supposed grief to gain sympathy, and gradually build a reputation for expertise in antique jewelry. The photograph of his deceased wife provided authentication for pieces he claimed were family heirlooms. Inspector Lake studied the telegram with grim satisfaction. The revelation explained both the elaborate nature of the deception and the desperate measures someone had taken to silence Quarles permanently. This suggests his murder was not merely about local fraud, but about preventing exposure of a much larger criminal enterprise. Dr. Randall, arriving with additional forensic findings, confirmed that the glove bore traces of the same silver polish compound that had killed Quarles. Whoever handled the contaminated cleaning solution left distinctive chemical residues. The pattern suggests they wore gloves while preparing the poison, but removed them afterward, leaving traces on the leather. Miss Marple, examining the glove with her magnifying glass, made an observation that sent a chill through the assembled group. How interesting that the ring finger shows a distinct indentation, as though from a band worn for many years but recently removed. Wedding rings leave such permanent marks, don't they? Even when one chooses not to wear them anymore. The implication hung in the air like incense. Someone among their suspects had been married long enough to bear such marks, but had recently chosen to appear unmarried. In a village where marital status was common knowledge, such deception suggested motives that extended beyond simple fraud. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Mrs. Price Ridley's garden, Inspector Lake found himself contemplating a crime that had grown from village gossip into something approaching a criminal conspiracy. The locked room had been achieved through mechanical ingenuity, but the murder itself had been motivated by secrets that reached far beyond St. Mary Mead's peaceful boundaries. The window that wouldn't reflect had become more than mere glass. It was a metaphor for the human tendency to see everything except one's own guilt. Soon Miss Marple reflected as she studied the faces around her that metaphorical reflection would become startlingly, devastatingly clear. The truth was approaching with the inexorable certainty of sunset, and like sunset, it would illuminate everything in its path, while casting the deepest shadows precisely where people least expected to find them. The glove lay between them on the garden table, its stained leather a silent testament to the fact that even the most careful criminals left traces of their passage through other people's lives. The stained glove lay between them on the garden table, like an accusation waiting to be acknowledged, and Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with the gentle attention she had perfected over decades of observing human nature under pressure. Each person's reaction to the evidence revealed something essential about their character, she reflected, though not always what one might expect. Mrs. Price Ridley's indignation carried the authentic ring of outraged innocence, complete with the sort of huffing and bristling that suggested genuine bewilderment at finding herself suspected of anything more serious than excessive nosiness. Matthew Winship's nervous fidgeting had intensified to the point where his camera strap had become hopelessly tangled, and his pale complexion suggested a man wrestling with knowledge he wished he did not possess, but was too honest to conceal indefinitely. Mrs. Caldecott, however, presented the most intriguing study. Her composed demeanor remained intact, but Miss Marple observed how her fingers repeatedly sought the absent sapphire brooch, and how she had unconsciously positioned herself so that her right hand remained partially concealed behind her reticule. Most tellingly, when Inspector Lake had mentioned the wedding ring indentation, Mrs. Caldecott's left hand had moved instinctively to cover her right, where a pale band of skin suggested recent removal of jewelry worn for many years. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, "might I suggest we examine this matter from a slightly different perspective? We have been assuming that Mr. Quarles was the victim of someone else's deception, but what if he was instead the victim of his own success at deception?" Inspector Lake looked up from his notes with careful attention. Miss Marple's observations had proven invaluable throughout the investigation, and her gentle suggestions often illuminated aspects of cases that more direct methods overlooked entirely. "Consider," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone she used when untangling particularly complex knots of human behavior, "that Mr. Quarles had established a pattern of using photographs of his deceased wife to authenticate fraudulent jewelry. The photograph we discovered was clearly recent, despite Tilda's identification of it as her dead sister. But what if the deception ran deeper than we initially supposed?" She paused to adjust her knitting, giving her words time to settle. What if Vera Quarles was not actually deceased at all? What if his entire widower persona was itself part of an elaborate fraud? The suggestion fell over the assembled group like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Tilda Pike's sharp intake of breath suggested sudden recognition of details she had previously dismissed, while Mrs. Caldecott's carefully maintained composure showed the first signs of genuine strain. Dr. Randall, who had been listening with the careful attention medical men bring to complex diagnoses, cleared his throat meaningfully. "That would explain something that puzzled me yesterday, Inspector. When I examined the body, I noticed that Mr. Quarles wore a wedding ring, but it showed none of the wear one would expect from 18 months of widowhood. The metal was bright, recently polished, with no scratches or tarnish marks consistent with extended wear during manual work with antique jewelry." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Exactly so, Doctor. A man who handles silver and precious metals daily would show considerable wear on a ring worn constantly for sentimental reasons. But a ring worn only recently, perhaps for the purposes of maintaining a particular deception, would remain quite pristine." Inspector Lake had been making rapid notes, his professional mind working through the implications. If Vera Quarles was alive, and if she had somehow discovered the extent of his fraudulent activities, that would explain, Miss Marple observed gently, why someone was willing to commit murder rather than simply expose his crimes. A wife's betrayal cuts far deeper than a stranger's greed, and the legal complications of a staged death would make simple exposure impossible for both parties. Tilda Pike, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this exchange, finally found her voice. "There was something odd about the photograph session," she whispered, her words barely audible above the afternoon breeze. "Mr. Quarles kept calling me by the wrong name. Not Vera, but Vivian. He corrected himself each time, said grief made him confused, but it happened so often that I began to wonder if he was thinking of someone else entirely." Inspector Lake leaned forward with sharp attention. "Vivian? And there was a letter," Tilda continued, gaining confidence as the burden of her observations found release. "It came to the shop last week, addressed to Mrs. V. Quarles. I thought it was a mistake, perhaps meant for his deceased wife, but Mr. Quarles snatched it away so quickly, and he seemed quite shaken by its arrival. He burned it in the spirit stove immediately, which seemed excessive for ordinary correspondence." Miss Marple's eyes had been moving between the faces around her, noting how Mrs. Caldecott had grown increasingly still as these revelations accumulated. The American widow's knowledge of antique jewelry, her immediate recognition of the genuine sapphire brooch, her careful pronunciation that occasionally slipped to reveal different vocal patterns. All these details assumed new significance when viewed through this lens of deception. Inspector Lake excused himself to send an urgent telegram to the Brighton Constabulary, requesting detailed information about the motor accident 18 months prior. Miss Marple, meanwhile, found herself studying Mrs. Caldecott with renewed interest, noting the way the woman's breathing had become carefully controlled, as though she were managing each inhalation with conscious effort. "Mrs. Caldecott," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for moments of delicate truth-seeking. "I believe you knew Mr. Quarles rather better than you initially suggested. Your knowledge of his methods, your immediate recognition of his substitution technique with the sapphire brooch, your familiarity with his cleaning habits, these suggest a relationship of some intimacy." Mrs. Caldecott's composure held for one more moment, her hands gripping her reticule with white-knuckled intensity. "I knew him professionally, as I stated. Nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I confess myself curious about the wedding ring mark on your finger. Such indentations are quite permanent, you know. They speak of years of wear, of a commitment that leaves its mark long after the symbol is removed. And the glove we discovered, it bears not only chemical residues, but also the particular wear pattern of someone accustomed to concealing such marks." The afternoon shadows had lengthened considerably as this careful interrogation proceeded, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating the tragic irony of a marriage that had become a criminal partnership, and a criminal partnership that had ultimately destroyed both participants. The locked room had been achieved through mechanical ingenuity, but the murder itself had been born from something far more ancient and terrible. The moment when love transforms into its opposite, when intimacy becomes the weapon that inflicts the deepest wounds. Inspector Lake's return with the Brighton constabulary's reply would, Miss Marple suspected, provide the final confirmation of what her observations had already revealed. The window that wouldn't reflect had indeed proven prophetic. Mrs. Caldecott had spent months looking at her husband's crimes without seeing her own complicity, just as he had looked at her growing revulsion without recognizing the danger it represented. Neither had been able to see their own reflection clearly until it was far too late to change the image that stared back at them. The truth was approaching with the inexorable certainty of sunset, and like sunset, it would illuminate everything in its path while casting the deepest shadows precisely where people least expected to find them. As Inspector Lake unfolded the telegram with grim satisfaction, Miss Marple prepared herself for the final act of a tragedy that had been 18 months in the making, a tragedy born not from greed or passion, but from the peculiar human capacity to deceive oneself so thoroughly that murder becomes preferable to facing the truth about what one has become. Inspector Lake unfolded the telegram with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making a critical incision, his expression growing grimmer with each line of text. The message from the Brighton constabulary was brief but devastating in its implications. Motor accident 18 months ago confirmed. Female victim identified as Miss Evangeline Caldecott, American tourist, age 52, traveling alone. Passenger Lionel Quarles claimed deceased was his wife Vera, produced marriage certificate dated 4 months prior. Investigation revealed certificate fraudulent. Real Mrs. Vera Quarles reported missing from Brighton lodgings same week. Both Quarles presumed to have assumed victim's identity and financial assets. Warrants outstanding. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of the church bell marking the half-hour. Miss Marple's knitting needles had ceased their gentle clicking, and she regarded Mrs. Caldecott with the compassionate but unwavering attention she reserved for moments when human nature revealed its most complex truth. Mrs. Caldecott, for she could no longer maintain even the pretense of that borrowed identity, sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap with the careful precision of someone who had spent months practicing perfect composure. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the cultivated American inflection that had colored her speech for so long. "You must understand," she began, her accent now clearly revealing the careful elocution of someone who had worked hard to rise above humble origins, "that it began as survival, not greed. Lionel and I were drowning in debts when that poor woman's motor broke down on the coast road. The fog was so thick that evening, and when her car went over the embankment, she was killed instantly. Inspector Lake made careful notes as this confession unfolded, though his expression suggested he was unsurprised by the revelation. Miss Marple, however, leaned forward with gentle encouragement, recognizing the relief that often accompanied the abandonment of long-held deceptions. Lionel saw the opportunity immediately, Vera continued, her voice gaining strength as the burden of pretense finally lifted. Miss Caldecott was traveling alone, carried considerable jewelry and letters of credit, and bore enough physical resemblance to me that the deception seemed possible. He convinced me that we could start over properly, escape the debts and disappointments that had trapped us in Brighton. Dr. Randall cleared his throat meaningfully. And the marriage certificate? Forged, of course. Lionel had learned such skills during his earlier difficulties with creditors. We staged the accident scene to suggest I'd been thrown from the car and killed, while he survived to grieve for his beloved wife. The real Miss Caldecott's body was badly damaged in the crash, making identification challenging for the local authorities. Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding. But the deception grew beyond your original intentions, didn't it, my dear? What began as a desperate escape became something much more elaborate. Vera's composure cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion beneath her carefully maintained facade. Lionel discovered he had a talent for fraud that went far beyond simple forgery. The antique business, the false provenance, the systematic deception of wealthy clients. It became an obsession for him. He began to believe his own stories about our sophisticated background, started taking greater risks with each successful deception. Inspector Lake looked up from his notes with professional interest. And you grew concerned about the increasing danger. Terrified would be more accurate. When he commissioned that photograph of Tilda posing as his deceased wife, I realized he had lost all sense of proportion. He was using my supposed death to authenticate stolen jewelry, creating increasingly elaborate stories about family heirlooms and inherited treasures. It was only a matter of time before someone with real expertise discovered the truth. The afternoon shadows had lengthened considerably as this confession proceeded, and Miss Marple found herself studying Vera's face with the careful attention she had perfected over decades of observing human nature under extreme pressure. So you attempted to end the partnership? I tried reasoning with him first, suggested we had accumulated enough to disappear properly, to start fresh somewhere else with legitimate identities. But he laughed at my concerns, called me ungrateful for everything he had provided. When I threatened to expose the scheme unless he agreed to stop, he became genuinely dangerous. Vera paused, gathering courage for the most damaging admission. He threatened to reveal my role in the identity theft if I didn't continue cooperating. Said no one would believe a woman who was legally dead and that I would face murder charges for Miss Caldecott's death, even though it was accidental. I realized then that he would never let me go. He would drag us both down rather than admit defeat. Inspector Lake had been making rapid notes throughout this exchange, but now he set down his pen and regarded Vera with the careful attention of a man preparing to close a case. So you decided to eliminate him before he could destroy you both. The blackmail note was my final attempt to force his hand, Vera admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I demanded he bring my genuine sapphire brooch to the fete, hoping I could recover my authentic pieces and disappear quietly. But when I went to his shop that afternoon, he was in a rage about my betrayal, cleaning the brooch obsessively while ranting about ungrateful wives and the impossibility of trusting anyone completely. Miss Marple's eyes had moved to the stained glove that still lay on the garden table, its leather bearing silent testimony to the chemical residues that had proved so deadly. You knew his habits well enough to predict exactly when he would use the contaminated silver polish? I had watched him clean that Georgian tea service every morning for months when we were still partners. His routine never varied. He would polish the silver, then immediately prepare tea using the same service. The timing was predictable to the minute. Dr. Randall leaned forward with professional interest. And the cyanide compound? I found the silver cleaning solution in his shop Wednesday evening when I went to retrieve some jewelry he had been examining. I knew enough about photographic chemicals from watching Matthew Winship's work to understand how certain compounds would react with the acids in silver polish. I mixed them together in his cleaning bottle, knowing the combination would only become lethal when he performed his daily ritual. Inspector Lake nodded grimly. And the timing device that locked the door? A simple matter of observation and preparation. I had noticed the way the bolt would slide home under its own weight if the door was jarred properly. The burnt cord technique was something I remembered from childhood. Country children learn such things for various mischievous purposes. For the first time, a ghost of a smile crossed her features. I set the device when I visited him at 3:15, spoke to him briefly about returning my brooch, then left well before the mechanism activated. As Inspector Lake prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of a partnership that had begun in mutual deception and ended in mutual destruction. The locked room had been achieved through mechanical ingenuity, but the murder itself had been born from something far more ancient and terrible. The moment when desperation transforms love into its opposite, when intimacy becomes the weapon that inflicts the deepest wounds. "Mrs. Quarles," Inspector Lake said formally, rising from his chair, "I am arresting you for the murder of Lionel Quarles and on charges relating to fraud and identity theft. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Vera Quarles, for that was her true name, whatever other identities she had borrowed, nodded with quiet dignity as the handcuffs were applied. The window that wouldn't reflect had proven prophetic in ways none of them had anticipated. She had spent months looking at her husband's crimes without seeing her own complicity, just as he had looked at her growing revulsion without recognizing the danger it represented. As the afternoon drew to its close and Inspector Lake led his prisoner away, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with thoughtful deliberation. The mystery of the locked room had been solved through careful observation and logical deduction, but the mystery of human nature remained as complex as ever. Two people who had loved each other enough to commit identity theft had ultimately found that love insufficient to prevent murder when their carefully constructed world began to crumble. The truth, like a proper reflection, had required exactly the right angle of light and honesty to reveal itself completely, qualities that had been in tragically short supply in the partnership between Lionel and Vera Quarles. Now, as evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village could return to its customary rhythms, though with the sobering knowledge that even the most peaceful communities could harbor secrets dark enough to kill for. The following evening found Miss Marple in her familiar chair by the sitting-room window, her knitting resting in her lap as she gazed across the village green where the remnants of Saturday's fete had been cleared away with characteristic efficiency. The bunting was gone, the tea tent dismantled, and the roses had returned to their customary audience of bees and butterflies, rather than admiring villagers. Yet something indefinable had changed in the atmosphere of St. Mary Mead, as though the events of the past few days had altered the very quality of light that fell across the peaceful scene. Inspector Lake had departed that morning after completing his paperwork, taking with him both Vera Quarles and the accumulated evidence of a fraud that had stretched across multiple counties. The Brighton Constabulary had confirmed every detail of Vera's confession, revealing a criminal enterprise far more elaborate than anyone had suspected. The genuine Miss Evangeline Caldecott had indeed been a woman of considerable means, and her tragic death in that foggy motor accident had provided the desperate couple with what seemed like salvation, but had ultimately become their destruction. Dr. Randall stopped by just as the church clock struck 6, bringing with him the final medical reports and an air of professional satisfaction. "Quite ingenious, really," he observed, settling into the chair opposite Miss Marple with evident relief. The way she exploited her intimate knowledge of his habits to ensure the poison would be administered at precisely the right moment. If she hadn't been so determined to recover that sapphire brooch, she might well have escaped detection entirely. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her needles clicking with gentle rhythm, though I suspect she wanted to be caught in the end. The burden of maintaining so many deceptions for so long must have been exhausting. There's a curious relief that comes with the abandonment of pretense, even when the consequences are severe. Tilda Pike appeared at the door shortly after, her color much improved since accepting employment with Mrs. Hartnell. The young woman had been struggling with guilt over her unwitting role in the deception, but Miss Marple's gentle counsel had helped her understand that she had been as much a victim as anyone else. "Miss Marple," Tilda began hesitantly, "I keep wondering if I should have seen something, should have realized what was happening. The way Mr. Quarles looked at that photograph, the questions he asked about my sister's appearance." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the young woman with compassionate understanding. "My dear, you must not torment yourself with such thoughts. We see what we expect to see, and you expected to work for a grieving widower who dealt honestly in antique jewelry. Your honesty about the photograph session provided crucial evidence for the investigation. Without your willingness to admit your role, Inspector Lake might never have unraveled the full extent of their activities." As Tilda departed with restored spirits, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the profound symbolism of Winship's peculiar window. The non-reflective glass had served as more than mere metaphor throughout their investigation. Both Vera and Lionel Quarles had spent months looking at the world around them without seeing their own roles in the destruction they were creating. They had observed their victims' weaknesses, catalogued their neighbors' secrets, and planned their deceptions with meticulous care, all while remaining blind to the inevitable consequences of their actions. The window that wouldn't reflect had forced everyone to look deeper, to see not what was presented on the surface, but what was hidden beneath carefully constructed facades. Vera had worn the mask of Evangeline Caldecott for so long that she had nearly forgotten her own face, losing herself in the reflection of someone else's life, until murder seemed the only path to freedom. Matthew Winship had reopened his shop that morning, though he remained visibly shaken by his unwitting role in documenting the elaborate fraud. The photograph that had seemed so innocent, a grieving widower's sentimental tribute to his deceased wife, had instead been a crucial piece of evidence in a criminal enterprise spanning multiple counties. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the curious way truth had a habit of emerging regardless of human efforts to suppress it. Secrets possessed a weight that eventually became too heavy for their keepers to bear, and deceptions required increasingly elaborate maintenance until they collapsed under their own complexity. The case had begun with what appeared to be an impossible locked-room murder, but the real mystery had been psychological. How two people who had once loved each other enough to commit identity theft had ultimately found that love insufficient to prevent murder. The village would recover, as villages always did, though the events would provide conversation for months to come. Mrs. Price Ridley would undoubtedly incorporate her brief status as a suspect into her repertoire of dramatic anecdotes, while life would resume its familiar rhythms with the resilience that characterized rural English communities. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the quality of village life. The residents of St. Mary Mead had been reminded that even the most peaceful communities could harbor secrets dark enough to kill for, and that the difference between victim and perpetrator was often nothing more than a series of small moral choices made under pressure. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared for bed, her mind already turning to tomorrow's domestic concerns. The mystery of the locked room had been solved. Justice would take its course, but the deeper mystery of human nature would continue to unfold in countless small dramas across the village. The window that wouldn't reflect had taught them all something valuable about the importance of honest self-examination, though she suspected that particular lesson would be forgotten long before the next crisis arrived, to test the village's capacity for both good and evil. Human nature, she reflected with affectionate resignation, remained remarkably consistent in its inconsistency, and that was perhaps both its greatest weakness and its most enduring source of hope.